This episode, I'm joined by philosopher Mads Højmark to discuss mytho-philosophy, the work of Ludvig Klages, Thaumaturgy, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep it going into the new year, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.
So, Mads Højmark, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
We are going to be discussing a sort of broad range of topics. You reached out to me because of the fact that I'd done a few episodes on Klages and interest in the podcast, and then you sent me your own stuff, which I then had to admittedly run through a translator because I will read anything on the work of Ludvig Klages, and so your focus on mytho-philosophy, on Klages, on myth, on chaos, on katabasis, on a lot of extremely interesting things. So it's going to be a very broad conversation, which is sort of born from, as we were jokingly saying before we began, born from the hopefully increasingly growing group of people interested in the work of Klages. It's born from this, maybe from an acknowledgement of our love of this strangeness of his philosophy. But before we go forward, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how would you describe your work?
Yeah, okay. And thank you for having me on, James. So I guess apart from being a Klages enthusiast, a fellow Klages enthusiast, I'm here by virtue of being somewhat of a mythomaniac, I guess. And I'm actually quoting a participant of one of my mytho-philosophical workshops that I've been doing over the last couple of years, who said that to me, I think like a year ago maybe. And he did add that he was using this word mythomaniac in the most positive sense, albeit not the usual sense of the word, being really enthusiastic about myths. And so a bit of facts about myself. I'm originally an MA in philosophy from the University of Southern Denmark, way back when. So I graduated back in, what was that, early 2003, so that's approaching 22 years. That's a long time ago. And since then, I've been living most of my working life in the public and private sector, doing in-house consulting, external consulting on topics such as leadership development, organizational development, dealing with change and transition, and stress and crisis, meaning and motivation, so on. And for the last many years, actually, I've been with the Danish Association of Lawyers and Economists, where I function as a counselor. And then it's not that I completely left philosophy or my love of myth by the wayside when that professional career began, but it did slide somewhat into the background. And then back in 2019, I became a member of the Danish Society for Philosophical Practice. Mm-hmm. And you have that type of organizations in several countries around. You have the US. I'm not really aware if there's one in the UK, but you have the APA, the American Practitioners, Philosophical Practitioners Association. There's one in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and so on. The one in Denmark stems back to actually just before I graduated. I became a member back then an alternate board member in 2020, and a full member of the board in, 2021. And I think so from 2019 is where I really started to rediscover my love for philosophy and myth. And it's been somewhat of and it is still somewhat of a journey, because I think I'm actually in the process of discovering what it is that I'm doing. And here we're probably already venturing to Klages territory, because how much do we actually know or comprehend about what is going on, even what we are doing ourselves? So again, the mythomaniac thing, and also I think even the term mytho-philosophy wasn't something I came up with. It was either Dr. Luis de Miranda, he's a researcher at the University of Turku in Finland, or it was Finn Torbjørn Hansen, who is a full professor of applied philosophy in Aalborg in northern Denmark. it was one of them who used it first about what I was doing, and I thought, yeah, that's probably what it is, or what one might call it. So it's kind of like an odyssey to be mythical here.
How would you define mytho-philosophy?
So I think basically it's just to start with the facts, it's the way in which I cannot not think.
Mm-hmm.
It's and to go a bit back to my campus years, I think I had a lot of like, maybe this goes for a lot of us. I guess I had a bit of like a imposter syndrome back then, because I was really not sure if I was actually good at thinking. Because a lot of my classmates were like very quick thinkers and like doing like logical deductions in the head and coming up with like quick answers during arguments and so on. And I was never really good about that. I think I tend to associate very quickly, but my thinking is kind of slow. And I think what I've found out is that maybe it was because of this interplay between mythos and logos, because what I've found is that whenever I try to deal with some mythical narrative, it takes like 2 seconds and some or several philosophical concepts will weigh in. And the same thing goes the other way around. I look at something, so it could be something that maybe Goethe said, or it could be like, I think Max Stirner, you've also covered him on your podcast, something about like the spooks in the head or something like that. And then immediately some or several mythical narratives weigh in. And I thought this was just me mixing things together and not being able to like think straight. And then what I found is that could be the case, of course, but there actually is a lot of commonalities. There are differences between mytho-symbolical thinking or approaching the world and then a more conceptualizing philosophical way of reflecting. But looking at it historically, there actually is a common ground in the act of wondering and the concept of the wonder, which we might get into in a bit. There's a whole like prehistory in the mythical literature about that. So when Aristotle or Plato says that philosophy begins in wonder, which is reiterated by Whitehead later on, it's not something that comes out of like the blue air. It is something they're speaking from a literature that they knew, of course, by heart.
There's pretty much everything we need to going forward there, I think. But I am really intrigued by something you said there. So you said the fact that we cannot not think, and this moves through to also something that maybe is a bit of a curse of the philosopher, is this, as you define it, association. You've actually made me realize I'm very much the same. My actual thinking, sitting, dwelling, thinking through is excessively slow, sometimes years until something, what is the actual deeper layer, bubbles to the surface. But associations are thrown throughout, just sort of ceaselessly. And I wonder that, are you suspicious then of that quick thought, which is really associative? Are you suspicious that it's in the terms, I mean, we're already sort of drawing on what the problem Klages is trying to deal with. Are you suspicious that quick thought that comes in is really the Geist that is trying to control, trying to say, oh, you've got this new mythos, you've got this perhaps strange other thing, but the associations come in to say, look, you do understand it. And it's, a logos, or a Geist of control, maybe.
Yeah, perhaps. I think at least this, I think what's interesting about the Klagesian concept of the understanding of the Geist, and this is of course a word that is very hard to translate, because what does he really mean by that? Is that the intellect, the spirit, the mind? What is it? It would seem like that's not really what it is per se. It's not the intellect per se. He actually does say that at the end of his like really monumental work, the Der Geist das Widersacher der Seele, spirits as adversary of the soul. And if for anyone who had read the Untergang des Abendlandes by Spengler, then the Klages' main work is longer, which says something. I think the Spengler work is 1,200 pages, and taken all together, the main work of Klages is 1,500 pages, something like that. I have it like in several tomes with his signature on the front page, actually, which is quite something. I can't quite. It is something like with a friendly greetings, remembering some meetup with someone whom, yeah.
This is so I just want to interject because you mentioned signature.
Yeah.
And now this isn't something intriguing. If you look up like Klages and things you can buy of Klages, right? There's not that many, obviously, but one of them is a picture of Klages with his signature cut out from somewhere else, pasted on, and he has a really janky, jagged signature. Is that the same as yours?
Not really, actually.
No. So when I see this, the only reason I mention that, right, is because if you look up like Klages' signature, there is actually one you can buy online that apparently is his, but it's the worst handwriting I've ever seen, which to me is a great irony considering his. I just wanted to mention, and you mentioned that you've got a signed edition, but I'm glad that maybe it was in his old age or something. I'm glad to hear that his actual signature is nice. Yeah, sorry to.
Oh yeah, no problem. And it's So the thing about the Geist is that he does say in like the concluding remarks, it's called the Rückblick in German, that you see that like an afterthought or something. He takes a bit of like people to task who said, "Hey, you're a irrationalist," and he says, "Well, yeah, if that means that I'm against the deification of or the idolatry with reason, then yeah, of course you can call me like an irrationalist. If that does mean, however, that I'm a like subjectivist or something like that, then no, thank you. I'm firmly on the side of rationalism." He actually does say that, so that's quite interesting. And he says that Geist is, so the essence of Geist or the nature or character of Geist is not located in the intellect, but in the human will, which is interesting. And I think there's something there because it's what definitely resonated. There's several things with Klages that resonates with me, but the Geist thing is one thing. There's also a lot of things you could criticize about his concept of the Geist, or at least you could question that. But I think, so one thing, it does highlight the difference between like thinking, like real thinking, and like the Heideggerian, like deep thinking, and overthinking. Like I think just on like a personal level, and I think I'm a person who's always been like prone to overthinking, and I know what it does to yourself, your personal life. And then the Geist, the Cartesian Geist, is also that phenomenon, but just like on a worldwide scale, something that actually ends up being unreasonable. So reason ending up being unreasonable and destroying everything around it. He has this picture with the wedge. He uses like several places also from Cosmogonischen Eros. That splits life apart and destroys and kills everything in its way. And I've seen that and experienced that with myself. So I think that's one thing. And like when you couple philosophical reflection with mythological narration, you tend to get this like reason, or this capacity for reasoning in a human being anchored in something that is, to me, is life with this myth, which is actually something that is not speaking about life, but is life itself. So it's not something speaking from over here about something over here. That's of course not something I can prove, and I'm not saying that it is life speaking like in an unmediated way. It is of course through human or at least humanly colored narratives. But to me, that's really what it is. And then the other way around, you could say, could like this free, like subconscious or pre-reflective association, this Lebensstrom, stream of life that myths encompasses, could that be just like too blind? Maybe, but again, I'm not really sure that I see that as something that's happening. So yeah, like that was a long talk.
No. That's really good. It's really good. It's intriguing. So, I mean, I want to ask you sort of, I guess it's probably a fairly obvious question because we can, in terms of mytho-philosophy, philosophy, I think we can leave the definition of that side fairly straightforward. But myth to you, does your mind immediately go, to the Greek myths, or are you thinking perhaps more in modern parlance, something more, Jungian in the terms of mythos, of something unconscious, collective unconscious. So, as you said, a pre-descriptive, pre-rational states. It's not. Is it specifically myths, or is it something broader?
Oh yeah, that's good. That's a good question. So, so I think maybe I think myth to me is actually several things. So it could be approached from several angles. And this goes back to me being, I'm kind of like hesitant to like box myself into some like ism, because I think I've done that a lot when I was younger, too much, and found that was. So again, Klages, he has from Cosmogonische Eras of Cosmogonic Eras, his work from the 20s. He does have this image of the ecstasy, and we can maybe get back to what that is, but something that liberates the incarcerated God. And when we put ourselves into like isms and try to box ourselves, and we actually go like the opposite direction, I think. And I found that I did that a lot when I was younger, in a kind of like a way to trying to like forcefully order the world. And that is perhaps exactly what Geist is about. And found that didn't work. That didn't really lead anywhere. But I think maybe we could try to get to approach myth by saying what I think it's not.
Okay.
So I think, how to put it? I think it is a myth. That myth is a myth, like in the modern sense.
Got it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So when you say, yeah, well, James, it's a myth that this or that. What we really mean is that it's not true. But like if you look into like the ancient literature, like the ancient Romans had this conception of mythos as what they called a vera narratio, so that's a true story. And you also have an expression from, I think it's mentioned at least in the Odyssey. I don't quite remember what song, but in Greek it's to all the like the fluent Greek speakers out there. I'm butchering Greek right now probably, but it's called aletheia mythosastai, which means something like to tell the truth or nothing but the truth, or to stick to the truth, or to tell the events as they unfold. And that's what I think that myth is. It is not explaining the world. So this is not like myth is not a primitive, pre-mechanical way of explaining the world, how it works, like cause and effect and so on. At least I don't think that was actually ever, but I can't prove that. But I don't really get that sense when I read like the ancient myths. I don't ever think that was like the main reason for having myth or for telling myths. It might have been something like later on that came to the fore, but I don't think it's about that. It's about participating in existence as it unfolds. It is almost, again, if you look at like the myths, they are driven very much by, of course, symbols, but also by verbs. So you have this action. It's something that it speaks to like a great becoming, I think. Where maybe if you look at philosophy, it's a bit more conceptual, centering on nouns, which is different. And then, of course, you have like very early Greek philosophy, which they didn't themselves call philosophy, so the pre-Socrates, so they're called philosophers by Aristotle, and they were called natural philosophers. I'm kind of not sure they're natural philosophers. I kind of get a sense that they're more like, at least not in the sense that we think of them. I think they are more maybe like existential philosophers, actually, which might sound weird, but when I read like Empedocles, the fragments, or Heraclitus and so on, I don't really see them trying to explain like cause and effect. No. And in a way, I see them kind of like showing reality as it unfolds, as a way of like contemplating and navigating and participating in it.
That's interesting. I mean, this is something I thought about recently because to jump, I guess, to a more modern myth, myths very much in that. I think myths in the way that you're thinking of them is more palatable to actually how myths are still alive today. Like, we don't really have modern myths to do with gods, but we do have myths, and one of the common ones is the myth, the now sort of accepted, I think, academically, the myth of disenchantment. But what you said about the myth is not a myth, or the myth is not a myth, it's not a myth, I can't remember how you said it.
Yeah.
It's realer than real, or truer than true, you could say. It is speaking a truth. Is that there's this, on an individual level, there's millions and millions of people who are religious, enchanted, practicing whatever it might be in a spiritual sense, mystical sense. And yet, this becoming of the Geist that's probably infected on a grander scale, the myth of disenchantment, or disenchantment as this idea, actually is very true. So it's at one and the same time, it's okay. You can look into the specifics perhaps in a more conceptual sense and say, well, when we look at the contexts, all these people are religious still, and yet there's still an acceptance of a prevailing myth of disenchantment, which comes from like the death of God. So there's, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because it tends to be it tends to be something that we just like say we live in like a disenchanted age, maybe. But what does that mean? It's the same thing. Like we live in like late modernity. Well, how do we know? Who says so? Who said so? So there's like a lot of like ideas that we're just taking for granted. There's also like the maybe times are different. Now, I think we have been shaken somewhat during the last few years existentially, most of us. And maybe we're going to go into that also, because I think the wonder is connected to that, or I see wonder as connected to that, like the as something that is a rift in the ordinary. But back when I was in campus, like in the mid-90s, there was a lot of people. It was kind of like this hegemonic idea that, like, if you're looking into like myth or religion, you kind of, we put that behind us. This is something, and yet there was a lot of like stuff taken for granted by people who said that, and people speaking of science, and this was some kind of like hypothesizing it as something, which is really like scientism, I guess, which is like a big. If you had to stick to like the modern idea of birth as something that is not real, then that's absolutely a thing, a modern myth like scientism.
So for you, this, I guess I think you've mentioned it there. I mean, what we're sort of tiptoeing around with this mytho-philosophy that isn't on either side, but is trying to understand something, is broaching this topic, what you define as wonder, as this area of difference, something different. So did you say a breach, a rupture in the ordinary?
It could be like a breach, a rift, something in the ordinary. And it's so I think maybe like wonders can be greater or smaller, at least in like perceived dimensions. But then again, a small wonder could be like a great wonder when you look at it. We get into what wonders might be just in a moment. But the Stoics, I think at least Seneca is one of those who use this idea about the circle, where they say that, so if something important happens to you, it doesn't matter if something that's apparently small or like a lesser thing, it could be a great thing even so. And he uses the image of the circle. So he says that the smaller circle is in no way lesser circle than the greater circle. And I think the same thing about the wonder. But there are some wonders that are harder to ignore. And I think with the wonders, again, and then so slowly opening up to this topic, the wonder in Greek is thauma, and it's and you have the verb, of course, thaumasign, to wonder at something, or be in a state of wonder, or the act of wondering is oftentimes connected with the divine, and it can, of course, be beautiful. It can also be terrible, and what is interesting about it is that most often it is very hard to recognize. So it oftentimes comes in disguise. If you look at like the Homeric literatures, that would be the Iliad, the Odyssey, so the two great epics, but also the Homeric hymns. I think it is in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the goddess Demeter, that we are told that the gods are hard to recognize and are usually disguised. But sometimes they arrive in a way where it's hard to ignore. And I think, so even if you're like a modern person, and if we have people that might find it a bit like troublesome to speak of the divine, what they might then do here is just envisage something that is greater than themselves, something that surpasses them. It could even be themselves, because I think we are still like, we contain greater depths than we know or will ever get to know as persons also. So it could also be like this inner wonder, but a really great wonder, and actually something that helped give birth to my project, for lack of a better word, was the COVID crisis. Because I think what happened there was, and I really remember this like it was yesterday. I think a lot of people have somewhat forgotten it, but I haven't. And it's, I think it was Friday, March 6th in 2020. I was out for dinner with a very good friend who's also very interested in mythology. And it was interesting. We had a burger, then we went out for a small walk to a small cafe in the neighborhood. And just on the way there, it's just a few minutes, there was a construction area. And then this was evening, so all the workers had gone home, and the area was sealed off. And it was dark, or it was at least twilight. And in Danish, that's interesting also, it's called tusmørke in Danish. And tus is related to thurs. It's like a giant troll in ancient Norse mythology. So you have this approaching darkness where, different forces awaken. And I looked at this area with the sealed off, fence around it, and you had these big lifts cranes standing there, like really tall, athletic giants, just completely standing there, just silent, just as if they were almost like in an undead state, and thinking, so here we have these great human creations, but they are created from material that we didn't create. What if they decided or were able to at some point just unleash their powers on their own terms? And then I didn't think about that anymore, just like an image I had. We went down, we talked about philosophy, and a few weeks later, everything was changed. The world was changed, was put upside down. And that, I think, was a wonder, because what happened there was something that completely changed the everyday of all persons in different ways, of course, because I have a small family. So in some way, my everyday life became more noisy and at the same time less noisy than when I was at the office, because all the endless chatter at the office, the endless creating of new projects, that's kind of ceased.
Mm-hmm.
There was, of course, a lot of noise. Jim, I had me, my daughter, my wife had to be under the same roof. But it was different. And then when you went outside, and Denmark is a small country, and what happened is, of course, that quite quickly people flocked into nature and out of the greater cities. I live in the Copenhagen area called Frederiksberg. And then what happens there is that actually nature in Denmark became the habitat of the humans and kind of scared the animals away. The cities, however, became the opposite. And you could tell by when you smelled the air, it was cleaner. You could hear there was a lot more chirping of the birds. This is ours now. So this completely turning around of everything. And I've been quite frustrated for at least a year of feeling there was something in me that had to be given birth to, and I couldn't get it out. And I had ideas about projects that should, and websites, and was it only one website, but then was it to be mainly about philosophy, or was it to be mainly about mythology? And then these lockdowns just made it possible, because it made me, and we had one lockdown. We were kind of released from that a bit for a few months. Then we were locked down again, then released, then locked down again. And then I think it was the second or the third time I had my eureka moment. I was rereading the Theaetetus by Plato. Mm-hmm. And there is actually a mention of a god called Thaumas, which I took as the name of my project. It is a god whose name is hard to say how exactly we might translate it, but it might be translated as the one who produces wonders, or the one who wonders. And I just thought, okay, so there it is. There's actually a god being brought up here in connection with what Socrates calls the arche philosophia, as the foundation of philosophy, like the arche, like the arch enemy, the arch there, the arche, the prime matter of philosophy, so to speak, is thaumasign, is the act of wondering. Mm-hmm. And you have this god being connected to it, and that's kind of where I was led into it. Yeah.
So do you think in a Klagesian sense then, that actually what Klages would understand as maybe Geist, but also reason, once again this problem of translation, is antithetical to wonder of that form? That wonder seems to, you don't have as much of a decision, because when we were talking about at the start, this associations always seem to come in and control, and they want to guide you, whereas the wonder of this form seems to not really have that sort of, you don't have the willed engagement that you might like in a reasoned world.
Yeah, I think definitely if you look at how Klages would describe or the Geist, the concept Geist is absolutely antithetical to this, of course, because it's about controlling and even over-controlling to the detriment of everything, including control itself. However, I'm not really sure that it is opposed to reason as such. But it's pre-reflective, and I think we shouldn't be too quick to conceptualize. It's better to just wait it out just a bit more. If you're dealing with myth and you're starting to conceptualize, and you think maybe I shouldn't box it in to the concepts, maybe just yet, then that's probably going to be good. Just give it like a week or two more. But yeah, definitely, and it's interesting because Klages doesn't use the word wunder in German really that much. He does use it a bit. It does use it in so there's a collection of essays called Menschen Erde. That's also, of course, Man and Earth. It's also like a lecture he did way back when, just before the outbreak of the First World War, actually. And it was overheard by Walter Benjamin of the Frankfurt School, who was completely taken aback by it. And he read so much Klages that Adorno was, maybe you should read any more of that stuff. I think that was, of course, McGonagall, that he was completely like enchanted by it, and Adorno became a bit. He actually found Klages quite interesting, but he became a bit concerned on behalf of Walter Benjamin. but leaving that aside, but he does. There is an essay called Brief über die Ethik, that's a letter on ethics, and he does mention that like the ambrosia of the soul. How do you nurture the soul? And he mentions that there is love or Liebe, of course, related to the cosmogonic eros. Also, there's like the example, and he's thinking of like the mythical examples, mythical figures, and then wonder. And he also has in his main work, Der Geist, das Widersacher der Seele, he does, and it's between a few of the books, you have like this front page, we has like a small aphorism, and I can't really quite remember it exactly in the head, but it's something like what couldn't just be a wonder became a work, and what couldn't just be a work became a deed. And I think what he's maybe implying there, is that wonder is something that carries its value in and of itself. And then it can also have like an effect, which is like the Werk, it would be in German, Werk in Danish. And then once it becomes like a deed, Tat in German, it is maybe something that is very instrumental in a Nietzschean sense, something that is human, also human. And what I think Klages is about, so his Geist conception is what he's against, what he's fighting. What he's really, what is pro is, I think, is of course the cosmogonic eros, and I think his Erscheinungswissenschaft is what he's calling it. So that's really like just a German name for phenomenology. So Erscheinung in German is something that shines forth, which is what phenomenon in Greek means, something that is shining forth. Is about like an updated version for the 20th century of what the ancient called so science have phenomena, which means let us save the phenomena. So something like not dissecting them, or at least letting them be for a while so they can speak for themselves. And there is a really, really good, of course, there's a ton of like mythical examples of this, but at least a good one, and one that shows what happens when we try to control, is from the Homeric hymn to Dionysus. There's actually several, but I think this is the longest one, and isn't that long. But it's the one where Dionysus appears as a young boy, and he's standing like beside the ocean, just as if he just like came in from the ocean. And he's spotted by a pirate ship. And the captain is looking, and they look at him. This guy in there on the shore, he looks like something like maybe some highborn person. Let's kidnap him and get and then collect the ransom, of course. And then and if you know Dionysus in a myth, you know this is going to go awry. This is going to end like in a bloody way. This is not going to end well because it doesn't take that lightly. And so they kidnap him, and they try to bind him, and that doesn't the chains won't really hold. And then one of the crew becomes concerned and say, I think we should let him go. I don't think this is like an ordinary person. And the captain and the rest of the crew are, no, we got this guy. This is clearly like an aristocrat. We're going to collect the ransom. And then it says in the text that, I think in Greek it is, Ephineto taumata erga. It means, and we have a collection of a lot of interesting words. It means wondrous events came to light. And ephineto is that's the verb, is connected to like finest eye, the shining forth of something. And you have taumata, that's like wonders, and erga is like event or effect. And what happens is that the ship is overgrown by vines and ivy and so on. And they get scared because you don't see that every day. Mm-hmm. And they try to get into one end of the ship. And then a big like lion appears, which is the god. They try to run at the other direction, at the other end of the ship. And a big like bear, which is also the god, appears, which just immediately kills the captain. And then the rest of the crew jumps into the ocean and gets transformed into dolphins. Except the one who recognizes there was something there, he gets to live. And so here they're trying to kind of like bind the wonder and maybe instrumentalize it for like their own petty purposes. And I think that is maybe one of like the main issues I see with like existence in the modern world. That's what we tend to do as humans. I tend to do it, but we do so to our own detriment. And of course, we, again, in the Klagesian sense, we kind of like kill everything around us all life.
Yeah, I think in binding wonder, even if you wanted to look at it in a psychoanalytical way, I think in believing that one has binded the unconscious or is controlling an archetype or fully understands an archetype, you have at the very least eschewed it, but at the very worst destroyed it, so it's actually incomprehensible. But this does bring up a sort of tough question, because when I was reading your work, I did sense that there is an element of there is a clear element of practical engagement, of something maybe that's leaning more towards, like, in a word, like something alchemical, right? A change, a development, or catabasis is explicit in your work. So in what sense do you think that in understanding wonder in that way, the Klagesian or the mythical way of you cannot bind it, and the one who just understood there was something there that was wondrous, lived, how do you see us as being able to have that practical relationship with wonder, where at one and the same time we leave it be, and yet it still transforms us somehow?
Yeah, and and that's of course, like, that's the $1,000 question, and it's so I think it, at least part of it has to do with like the sequence of how we go about it. So where do we start? Do we start up by trying to conceptualize or overtly conceptualize, or do we start with the listening part, or the kind of like the letting the wonder appear? And it's so again, to take like a mythical example of this, there could be several. One of them that Klages is kind of like keen on, he's using it at least twice in his main work, is the story of the Old Norse god Odin sacrificing himself on a great tree. It's usually taken to be like Yggdrasil. That's actually not explicitly stated in the text, and we only have like one source for that narrative, which is from the Højmark, that is the sayings of the High One, and it's an old Eddic poem. And then there's a part of that called Runatal, which means like the rune song, or the narrator of the runes. And that is where we get the story of him hanging on a windswept tree for 9 whole nights. We are never told the name of the tree, only that it is windswept, and that it has roots that are unknown, or that reaches down into the great unknown, or that springs out from somewhere that no one has ever seen, which is interesting. And so he hangs there, and this is interesting also because he is not in the active here. He's not actually doing something. He's just hanging there, exposed to like the elements. And I'm thinking like elementaris and eros in the Klagesian sense, like elementary eros, the raging elements. And he's also, and that is coming back to like this, the wonder as a rift in the ordinary. He's pierced by a spear, as is Christ actually, also, after he dies, at least one of the Gospels. But it's interesting that if you look into the words there, is that so in Greek we have thauma, meaning a wonder. When you say that in Danish, and of course this is not how it sounds in Greek, but you say thauma, and then you say trauma, which is or trauma. They tend to kind of like sound like the same. They are not etymologically connected in Greek at all. But that might just be the case. This is not something that we are like 100% able to verify, but in Germanic languages, it does seem that there is a etymological connection between wound and wonder. In German, that would be Wunder and Wunde. And in Danish, you have, so if you ask a Dane today, he would use like for wound, it would be sore. But there's older, it's kind of like used more poetically today in this, which is Wund. This is the same as in German, basically. And you can almost hear that Wunde, Wunder, Wund and Wonder, and so on. And when Odin hangs on the tree, so it says in Old Norse that he hangs there and is wounded by a spear. And that is Geiri Undrat in Old Norse. So he's perforated or wandered, perhaps, by the spear. And then what happens is that just at the end of these 9 nights, he looks down again, like so he's lifted up, he's looking down, but there's a lot of things about this up and down, and you know how Klages said, or Semi for saying that the way up and down is the same. Whatever he meant by that, probably he meant several things. But he looks down and he takes up the runes with a scream. And we can ask from where. But we know that he hangs on a tree that has its roots down in the great unknown. So he's taking it from some like the great unknown variable in the great equation of life, which I think is like the great abyss, the great deep. And the interesting thing is that rune, most people will think of it as a letter from the pre-Latin alphabet in ancient Scandinavia, which is true that it's also that, but it does mean something like a secret, or in Latin you would use the word mysterium. And it's also connected to the modern German Raunen, which means a whisper. And what is interesting is that when someone whispers to you, that the thing that they whisper about is usually quite important and is something intimate, and it requires you to listen carefully. Not just in your usual, you have to listen extra carefully to hear the whisper. And that's what I think the wonder is about. It's about listening in a particular way. And again, accidentally interesting thing again about the runes, to see just how it was used later on. In the first translation of the Bible into a Germanic language, made by Bishop Wulfila, of a translation of the Bible into Gothic. When he translates Timothy, letter to Timothy, the first letter, I think it is. I remember exactly where that is, 9 something, I'm not sure. But it's the mystery of faith, Mysterium Fidei. He translates that as Runa Glaubenais. And you can hear the Runa and Glaubenais, you can hear Glaube, faith, in German. So we have to do with something that is mysterious and where we have to listen carefully. And we have to be in a state of receptiveness, passiveness, and not trying to control in order to at least get access to it. Then later on, what Odin does is he receives some rune songs and he teaches them to others. And they start to have an effect. But that comes like down the line. It also does put him in, so when he falls down from the tree, he gets a drink of the mead of poetry, which is called, sometimes it's the cauldron where it's contained, sometimes it's the mead itself. It's called Udrørir in Old Norse. It means the thing that stirs the mind, stirs up the mind, something like this, stirs up the soul. And it's and again, the name of Odin is connected to a Wut in modern German, like rage. But we have to think like maybe not being like mad in a modern sense or angry, but maybe more like Thaumaturgy, it's divine madness. As is Dionysus, who is also connected with the bear, which is Odin is too. And so I think there's something here also about the ecstasy, because he hangs there, and he mentioned the purpose of hanging there is that he hangs there in Old Norse, sjálfum mér, meaning myself, given to myself, but that word in Old Norse means as a human sacrifice. And so we have a self being sacrificed to another self. That is perhaps both because he's on a tree that reaches up into, to the clouds and down deep into the earth. So he's probably sacrificing his usual everyday self to another greater self that is both higher and deeper. And that's what I think is going on when we are in an act of wonder. When it's like true wonder, that's what's happening.
I would perhaps say that what intrigues me most there, and I guess also with Klages, is that the intriguing element of that myth in particular is we rarely focus on the chthonic downward routes that go down to the underworld. We might try, and maybe we'll eschew it, the shadow in Jung or something like that. But the fact that element, and not just the upward element, this light shining down, which is usually quite pleasant, but the roots going down to the chthonic, something coming up, that's not something we give much time to nowadays, I would say. So that's this great deep, this chaos for Klages and for yourself. What do you think is there that's transformative that we don't get from that usual logocentric, transcendent idea?
Yeah. So I think so. So at least if we are to interpret like the great deep in maybe like in a phenomenological or way, or in the way of like existential philosophy, or using an existential approach, I think it's kind of like where it's the place of both like the birth, but also like the rebirth and the going under, and the great existential reboot, you could call it. And it's also interesting because at least in some sources, it's described by way of like the via negativa. So it's described by mentioning what it's not. That happens in the Old Norse poem Völuspor, the serious prophecy, and it also happens in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian the epic of creation, or one of them, the one that we have that is carried over to us. But in both of those, starts out with, so the serious prophecy is like, first it's a command to listen. So hear me, all like higher and lower descendants of Heimdall, is said, and then you, and she's addressing, so this like a vulva here, probably like an undead giantess, is mostly something again undead from the underworld. He's probably in the underworld, or in a state of catabasis, waking up someone there. And she says, so I remember the earliest of time, which makes her quite old, then probably with like at least 1 foot in chaos, or it would be, the name of that would be Ginnungagap in Old Norse mythology. And she remembers that there was no heaven, no sky, no beaches, no grass, and so on. So we start hearing what is not. And the same goes, that's also how the Enuma Elish starts. Back then there was no heaven, that's actually the first, no heaven, no earth, and so on. And so it's clearly about something that we cannot conceptualize. Once we does, it's not that anymore. And we do get some concepts, but they tend to be at one point swallowed up again. They have to return to the great deep, and that goes for like whole worlds. It also goes for mythical items. So a famous example would be the great sword Excalibur, like of the wonders are tales of the British Isles, and also of course of France and and Europe and the whole, like the Arthurian romances. It's told. I know the version I know best is from Sir Thomas Malory, the Morte d'Arthur, from it's around 1480 something, I think. And at the end of it, you have Arthur and Mordred killing each other, and he's laying on the ground dying. I think it's Sir Bedivere approaching, trying to find him, and he's lying there laying there like mortally wounded, and he says to Bedivere, so you see this Excalibur, this sword of the kings, which came from the lake, given to him by the lady of the lake after the sword he got from the stone broke. So it's not the same sword, at least not in Mallory. You have to do a great service to me now. Yeah, anything, my liege, anything. And you have to take this sword. You find the biggest lake you can, and you throw it as far out as you can. And he's like horrified. No, you can't do that. It's like the greatest sword in the world. Like the whole order of the world depends on it. Yeah, but this is the right way to do. This is something that has to be done. Mm-hmm. And also the lady of the lake did mention at one point early on that I have to get it back. Mm-hmm. And he goes out there, and he's just to throw it in, and no. And I think he hides it in a tree. He goes back to Arthur and says, do you do it? Yeah. So what did you see? Yeah, I saw it like waters and waves. And he said, well, you didn't do it. Now go and do it. Yes, I will. And he goes out to the lake. He's just about to throw it. And well, I can't do it. And he hides it under his saddle, goes back. Arthur asks him, did you do it? Yeah. What did you see? I saw like water and mist. But you didn't do it. Now go and do it, or you are a traitor to me. And then he goes, he wraps his belt around it, and he just flings it out there as long as he can. And it is caught by a hand who waves it around 3 times, just brandishes it, and puts it down. So, and then of course, we hear Arthur dies. But then it is said that he's taken to some mysterious island, and where he is buried. But then Mallory writes, yeah, but there's some who say that on his tombstone it says, Hic jacet Arturus rex quandram rex prefuturus, which means, here lies Arthur, he who was once a king, he who will once again be king. But maybe only because he has to die and the sword has to go into the lake. So I think it is the place of like existential death and rebirth, and which brings us back to philosophy, because one of the things that Socrates talk about a lot is he calls his art of like dialoguing, he calls it mythophilosophy, that is midwifery. And that is giving birth. But before you get born, you get put into a tomb, kind of, in the womb. It even rhymes a bit there. And again, how many nights are Odin on the tree? Like 9 nights. Mm-hmm. Again, there's actually even from like the gospel stories, the darkness falls upon the earth on the 9th night also. So and then in the 9th hour, that is, not 9 nights, he's only there for so long. So there's something there with the symbolism of the 9. And there's again in Hesiod, I forgot if that's the Theogony or the Works and Days. It's one of them. You hear that if you take like an anvil and you drop it from the Olympic heights, it takes like 9 days for it to reach Earth. And then if you drop it from Earth, it takes like 9 days for it to reach into Tartarus. So there is something there. And I think that definitely alludes to this death and rebirth theme. It's also in the Homeric hymn to Demeter that I mentioned earlier, where it starts out with the daughter of Demeter, Persephone, called Proserpina in Latin, walking in a meadow with a lot of like beautiful flowers. There's one of them that's more beautiful than the others, in Narcissus, related to narcotics and falling asleep, and so on. And she reaches out for it, and again catabasis, the earth opens up, and Hades drags her into Hades. And then Demeter searches for her for 9 days. And it is said at some point that she has to go there and be there for like the whole winter in order to be able to return as what is in Greek is called here in the text, a megathauma, a great wonder for both the immortals and the mortals. Mm-hmm. So she can only become a wonder if she goes into the underworld to come back again. And the same thing happens on like a cosmic scale in a serious prophecy in Norse mythology. You have, of course, the big cataclysm at Ragnarok, the destiny of the gods. So actually, what it doesn't mean like a destruction. It means the destiny, but the destiny is the going under, and it's so a lot of things happens. Giants and gods killing each other left and right, so almost no one's left. The great giant Surt, I think we should think of him as means black, the black one, because he's burned probably. Probably looks kind of like a Balrog from Tolkien, comes and burns down the whole world. And then you also hear that just before the earth sinks into the sea, the firmament is cleft in two. Again, like a giant astronomical, extraordinary rift in the ordinary happens. And then everything is gone. And then at some point you have the earth re-emerging from the waters. But now everything is growing by itself, not being sowed by any hand. And a lot of things happen. A few gods will come back, but the gods find something that they apparently lost, which are some golden pieces for playing board games. And that's interesting because what characterizes games? It is that they are what Gadamer, Hans Georg Gadamer, in his Truth and Method, Wahrheit and Methode, he speaks about the phenomenology of playing or games. And he says something that characterizes games is that they're serious. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's not just for fun necessarily, but they are also teleological. They have their own purpose in themselves, like their worth in themselves. And these, perhaps it's kind of like a sort of chess, perhaps we have to imagine. These chess pieces are described in the Old Norse text as undersamliga, that is, wondrous, wonderful, or akin to a wonder. But they are only rediscovered after the going under of the world.
That's super. That's fascinating. I mean, when we were speaking before we started recording, we both agreed that there's this problem with the modern definition of existentialism, where no one seems to really be able to do. I wonder if the problem is that a lot of modern existentialism, especially of the Sartrean type, doesn't engage with that going under, that death, and then that form of rebirth. Maybe that would be too mythical for him, but. See, it seems then that what arises from that in terms of these golden pieces, this ability to play games with something that is symbolically golden, is a sort of the death of something that is actually the living dead, and the arrival of a Lebensphilosophy, an arrival of a self that can now truly live in the sense of a serious game, a mythical enjoyment. Maybe, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because there's definitely something there, because I think maybe there's kind of like two poles that one should like avoid when dealing with myth, at least to my mind. So one thing is like, or just the wonder of life. I think the two of us being able to speak here, you're in the UK, I'm in Denmark, just like coming across each other, like in this like weird digital world, is that is a wonder to me, being able to sit here and, not treating that as something to be overtly like instrumentalized. That is one thing. But also I think that the wonder and myth is not like entertainment either, because that's something you just use for like fast food or for like enjoyment, and you leave it by the wayside. I think it should be something that in some way transforms us, which it will, at least in my experience, if we let myth, let the wonder work its magic. And it's and really a wonder could be like everything. It could be. So I think, again, going back to like the COVID crisis, what that thing did to me, at least, was that it's not that I was oblivious to all like the small wonders like in everyday life before that. It just became much more apparent to me where they were and what they were. Just like meeting with like this like random guy that walks at his dog. Like when I go to the office, I'm usually the first one there. I'm really early. I only meet like one or two people, which are the same people, and we almost didn't see each other during that period. And I really missed talking, just shooting the breeze for a few minutes, and thinking. I actually to this day I don't know his name. I don't know what he's called, but that is a wonder. You talk with someone on your path, like some random stranger or some people that you pass by. We tend to take that for granted, but there's nothing to be taken for granted. At that, me sitting here with you, that is to me something that is extraordinarily wondrous, and I have the same feeling every time when just maybe like remembering the myths, but also reading them. So you would think, and I think a lot of people who are not like into myths would think that this like ancient, boring, dusty, weird stories. well, that's not, to my mind or my experience, is not what happens once you look into like the well of Urt, or what you call it, and you look into this mythopoetical well. You would think it would be like you have like this, like centuries or millennia dead stories, and then what happens is that they just leap up at you like they were born like 2 minutes ago, and fills you with life and like the meaning. And what comes to me every time is like a deep sense of wonder that I can't believe this is happening. And it's interesting that I would feel that, because maybe it just happened yesterday also, but it's kind of like it happens anew every time. And then I'm filled with a deep sense of gratitude. That I can't believe it's there. I haven't done anything to earn those stories being there, anything. I haven't made those stories, but they are there. And once you just press the button, they just start unfolding. Just like that. Now that is a wonder. That is something to be grateful for.
Is there anything you'd like to add about mythophilosophy or your work that you feel is key that we haven't touched upon?
There's probably a lot, but sometimes a story doesn't get stronger just by adding or piling onto it. So yeah, I'm probably going to think of something like in 2 minutes, but we've been far around, so probably that's at least the most essential things I think we've touched upon here.
And where can we find, most of your work is not in English, but whereabouts can we find your work?
Yeah, that's it's true that actually I think all of it, but just one thing is actually in Danish. So far, I might be publishing something in English somewhere down the line. I have one thing, but I'm not really sure if people would understand that. It's the small poem Fire Dancer. It's actually a small poem that I composed. At least a skeleton of it was composed like how long is that? It's 30 years ago maybe. Back in my campus years when I was a heavy metal drummer. And it was supposed to be the lyrics for his song that we never got to publish before we disbanded. So that's the only thing I have in English. But otherwise, I do have the Thaumaturgy website, but it's only so far in Danish. People can find me on LinkedIn. Of course, I have a LinkedIn profile in both Danish and English, so there's a bit about me there. And then I'm on a platform also called the ERA, that's the Enriched Realities Assembly. It's a newly established accent research exchange platform. Again, it's established by Dr. Luis de Miranda of the University of Turku in Finland. And I'm also going to be doing some counseling in the realm of this platform. But it's a short description of me there also. What I'm about, very short. So there's most of it, and sorry to the rest of the world and the non-tiny part that is speaking Danish. But you can't really find anything as of yet apart from that. Okay, there's also actually an interview on YouTube with me by Luis de Miranda called I think it's called Mythophilosophy and Philosophical Health. So there's that. We're going into at least some of the things that we've been talking about today also. So. So I think that's it for now, where people can find me, but hopefully more is to come.
Okay. Well, Master Højmark, thanks very much. It's been a really great conversation.
Yes, thank you also, James. It was a pleasure being here. And thank you for inviting me.